Today, we're diving into a poet who didn't just write about his time. In so many ways, he actually defined it. This is the story of a true giant of English literature, Alfred Lord Tennyson.
To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. I mean, just listen to those words. They're some of the most powerful ever written, and they perfectly capture the restless, ambitious spirit of the man we're talking about today. So let's get into it.
So who wrote that line? None other than Alfred Lord Tennyson. He was a truly pivotal figure who became the poetic voice for an entire age of dramatic, sweeping change, a time when people were grappling with huge questions about progress and who they were.
Now, this wasn't just some small-time gig. For over 4 decades during Queen Victoria's reign, Tennyson held the super prestigious title of Poet Laureate. And that wasn't just an honorary role, you know. It gave him a national platform. It basically made him the official poetic commentator for the British Empire right at the peak of its power.
And you have to understand, his career landed smack dab in the middle of the Victorian era. This was a time of incredible steam-powered progress, but also just profound social upheaval. His work became a perfect mirror for all the anxieties and the hopes of his time.
And this is where it gets really interesting. His poetry basically became this cultural battlefield. He just waded right into the biggest debates of the day, that huge clash between religious faith and shocking new scientific discoveries, and the constant tug-of-war between old traditions and the relentless march of modernity.
Okay, so how on earth did he tackle these huge modern problems? Well, he did something kind of brilliant. He reached way back into the past. Tennyson had this absolute genius for taking ancient stories and making them feel totally new and urgent again.
I mean, he took these stories of King Arthur and Camelot, tales that could have felt super old and dusty, and he just breathed new life into them in his massive work, Idylls of the King. He made them resonate deeply with his Victorian audience.
And through these old stories, what he was doing was tapping directly into the Victorian mindset. Idylls of the King celebrated all those ideals they loved, like chivalry and honor, but it also voiced this deep, nagging fear they had, that betrayal and moral rot could cause even the greatest society to crumble from the inside.
And he didn't stop with King Arthur. He did the exact same thing with Greek myths. In his amazing poem, Ulysses, he doesn't just retell the hero's journey home. No, he asks a much more interesting question. What happens after the adventure is over? He pictures this hero back home, but he's restless, unfulfilled, and just itching for one last great quest.
But, it wasn't just ancient myths that Tennyson used to explore these deep emotions. Maybe his most profound, most personal work came not from legend, but from just immense personal tragedy.
So what happened was his best friend, Arthur Hallam, died suddenly. And it completely shattered him. This awful loss led him to write In Memoriam, which honestly is now seen as one of the greatest, most raw poems about grief ever written in English.
And when I say he wrote about it, I mean he really wrote about it. The poem is massive. We're talking 131 different parts, written over a period of 17 years. That's not just a poem, it's practically a logbook of his entire journey through grief.
So this type of poem is called an elegy, a piece about loss. But this was so much more than just a sad poem. It was this epic, soul-searching exploration of doubt, of sorrow, and that agonizing search for meaning when the world suddenly feels cruel and totally random.
And that is why it hit so hard back then. The poem is brutally honest about the journey, all the way from raw despair and doubt to, finally, this hard-won reconciliation with faith. For a Victorian audience that was having its own crisis of faith, this was incredibly powerful stuff.
All right, let's switch gears a little. You might think of him as this traditional establishment guy, right? But what's really surprising is how he tackled one of the most forward-thinking issues of his time, women's rights.
He wrote this poem called The Princess, and the story was, for its time, totally groundbreaking. It's about a princess named Ida who basically says no thanks to marriage and instead founds a university just for women, totally separate from the world of men.
So let's just look at the contrast here. It's night and day. On one side, you have the typical Victorian rules. Women belong in the home. On the other, you've got Princess Ida's radical vision. A world where women live for themselves, use their minds, and decide their own destinies.
So this all leads to a really fascinating question, doesn't it? Was Tennyson some kind of early feminist? Now, the poem's ending is, well, it's complicated. But the very fact that he was exploring these ideas shows he was way more complex on social issues than a lot of people give him credit for.
So what's the big takeaway here? Why does a poet who died well over a century ago still matter to us?
let's break down why his legacy is so enduring.
So, why do we still care? Well, his legacy is huge, and it breaks down into a few key things. First, he was just an absolute master of the English language. Second, he wrote about the big stuff, the timeless human experiences, love, loss, that search for purpose we all go through. And he had that amazing trick of blending old myths with modern worries, capturing the very soul of a rapidly changing world.
And that leaves us with one final thought, something that connects his time directly to ours. In our own age of crazy fast technological and social change, facing our own anxieties about the future, his question is still our question. How do we strive to seek, to find,